I am Amber Buckley Shackley. I'm a grad student at the University of Illinois in sociology.
Why are you involved in community?
I think it's really important for people with disabilities to have accessible housing where they can interact with other people with and without disabilities out in the community. It's really difficult to find good, accessible, affordable housing. So I wanted to be involved with the Able community to hopefully make that happen.
Why should other people get involved?
I think the idea of having accessible housing for people with disabilities, having them living in the community instead of, say, institutional settings, is beneficial for everyone, not just people with disabilities, because people with disabilities have a lot to offer to communities, to diversity in communities. So having a community based kind of integrating housing for people with disabilities, I think can be beneficial to everyone. And it's obviously beneficial to people with disabilities because it'll be good, accessible housing in the community.
Can you talk about the experience with accessible housing and
Um, yeah, I've lived in various accessible housing, many on college campuses. So the first, which was a dorm for students with disabilities at the U of I. So there was mainly students with physical disabilities living there, but also some personal care attendants who worked there lived there. Um, and I've lived in other accessible apartments and housing on the U of I campus and when I lived in Washington, D.C., and accessible apartments in Madison when I lived there one summer.
did you have a hard time?
Finding accessible housing?
Yeah.
Um, there are very limited options for accessible housing in lots of places, particularly affordable accessible housing. For example, in Champaign, there's lots of new apartment complexes going up, but a lot of them are very, very expensive to live in. So even if they do have a few accessible units, first of all, they're usually bigger, so they're usually units that go quickly, not necessarily to people with disabilities, kind of just who agrees to sign a lease for those units first. And they're really expensive, so it's hard to afford them. Um, and Madison and Washington, D.C., bigger cities, housing's just super expensive in those cities. I think Washington's the most expensive area to live in the country. So finding typically places that are accessible are newer places because older places are not accessible, and then they're a lot more expensive to live in. So it's kind of this, you need accessible housing, but you can't necessarily afford the accessible housing that exists. Did it work for me?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think the accessible housing that I've lived in, most of it's been on college campuses. So I think they're probably more accessible than just apartments in the community. Um, but it's not always as accessible as it needs to be. It's kind of like, well, you have to adapt. You have to, in my case, like I can't use certain things, so I'll have to have my PA do it or have someone else help me with it. So even though it technically might be accessible, it's not really fully accessible. It's usable, basically.
You want to talk about the having to have background checks for your PA?
Background checks with PAs?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, on campus here, they require background checks for PAs to have access to the building. And I need PAs to help me get out of bed in the morning, so I can't go meet the PA at the front door, obviously, because I can't get out of bed. So they have to have independent access to the building, basically. So the university requires us to have background checks on them before they grant them access, which is fine to do, but then they also require us to pay for them, and they will not accept the background check that is free for people with disabilities who have PAs paid for by the state. They require us to do a separate background check through the university that costs between $30 and $60 per PA. And I have typically between 5 and 7 PAs a semester. So obviously it gets quite costly pretty quickly. Some people I've known have had 10 PAs, so $30 a pop, that's $300, so it's a lot of money. I think having the background checks is fine. I think requiring students with disabilities to pay for them, I see it as basically charging us an extra fee to use the residence hall. So I have not been too happy with that, and I let them know that, but they didn't seem to really care what my opinion was, so that's kind of how it is.
As a sociality, why does able community make sense?
Wow. Do you want like a dissertation about that?
No.
Why does it make sense? I think there's several reasons why it makes sense. I think it fills a need for accessible and integrated housing that is not available to lots of people with disabilities. So it provides housing for people with disabilities, which is in short supply oftentimes, which I think is a need in itself. It provides integrated housing for people with and without disabilities. So I think it's always great to have people from different backgrounds living together, learning from each other. I think, research clearly shows that that's beneficial to have people from different backgrounds living together because they do learn a lot about diversity and stuff. So there's that. And I think really since currently there's not necessarily great services and supports for people with disabilities and great housing for people with disabilities, that it will kind of be filling a void that there currently exists. So look at the camera and say, "We are able community."
Yeah.
Like with a lot of energy and excitement. We are able community. We are able community. We are able community. they're laughing in the background. Stop laughing. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. We are Able Community.
Thank you.